For newer players who are just starting their Rainbow Six Siege careers, understanding and choosing settings can be difficult, with all of the menus being extremely long, convoluted, and difficult to understand early on. This is why you see newer players have awful settings all the time, and my goal in today's video is to tackle that problem by showing you my settings that I've used to achieve Diamond and Champion consistently over the past 2 years. So even if you are an experienced player, there is likely some useful information in here for you as well. Anyways, let's go ahead and get into the video. Now, the first page of the settings tab in Rainbow Six Siege is the general tab, and this is mostly going to be filled with settings that are personal preference, and they just so happen to be some of the least important settings in your gameplay overall. But I'll still be going through this tab and showing you some of the more important settings, and I'll be showing you what I have them set to. Now, the first important setting in this menu is the display performance metric. What this setting does is it shows your FPS in the bottom left corner of your screen when you're playing games, and it'll also show you things like ping and important stuff like that. Me personally, I don't think my metrics are super important because it's not something I need to see in the middle of gameplay, so I just turn this off in most situations. The only time I'll turn this on is if I'm noticing some issues with my PC with it stuttering or something, and so I'll use it as a way to troubleshoot. Now, to go below this setting, the next setting that's super important on this page is the cycle inside camera group setting. Basically what this setting does is it stops you from switching in between the two camera groups using your Q and E buttons, and instead you have to use 1 and 3 to swap between different camera groups. So if you want to go from the default cameras to the Valkyrie cameras, you have to click 3 or 1 respectively. This prevents you from accidentally swapping over to a different group, and it's just way more convenient for moving in between the different cameras. The next important setting is a diffuser pickup. And for this setting, I'm going to recommend that you turn this on to both. What this allows you to do is it allows you to pick up the diffuser automatically, meaning that when you walk over the diffuser, it's automatically going to get picked up by you when you walk within a certain radius. And you're also going to be able to pick it up manually by clicking a button, which will allow you to pick it up from a farther range than you would be able to if you just walked over it. This setting needs to be on so that way if you get involved in a gunfight or something, you can still pick up the diffuser by walking over it instead of having to click the button manually. But having manual on will allow you to pick it up from a distance, like I said before. Then for visible throw trajectory, I like to turn this setting on so that way I can see how my gadgets are going to be deployed when I'm throwing them from a distance. This will allow you to hit nitro lineups a lot easier, and it'll allow you to throw Valkyrie cameras much more accurately. Then for drone after prep phase, this is going to be entirely personal preference. Me personally, when I'm in the prep phase, I'm normally hiding my drone in a position on the map to use as a camera later on. I'm not normally continuing on my drone in the prep phase, and so I always turn this on to automatic because I very rarely find myself droning in the building immediately after the prep phase. Now for the next important setting, which is the text chat channel, I would recommend most players to set this to team only. The reason why I say that is because now, that's pretty much it for the general tab. Now for the HUD tab, this is where things get a lot more subjective. Now, obviously the HUD settings are extremely important, but there are a couple important HUD settings that in my opinion can dictate whether or not your HUD is good or not. Now, the compass is a huge topic in the community. A lot of people are mixed on whether or not you should have this turned on. I know a lot of people just turn it off and call it a day, but for me personally, I do think that the information that the compass provides can be useful in specific situations, but I like to keep it on the simplified setting because it'll look a lot smaller in the bottom of your screen. Whereas if I was to go to the settings and turn it to advanced, it's a lot bigger on your screen, and it also takes up just a lot more space and doesn't look nearly as good. Also, to go along with this, I like to turn the loadout inputs off because if you have loadout inputs on the bottom right of your screen, you're just going to see a ton of keyboard keybinds on your screen that in my opinion just doesn't look as good, and it also just takes up more space on your screen. And since I know all my keybinds by heart, I don't need to have this on my screen 24/7. But if you're someone that is newer to the game, then you might want to have these settings in the bottom right corner to make it easier for you to remember your keybinds. That same philosophy applies to a ton of other settings like the action reminder bar, all of the reminder related settings, and also a few other settings in here related to keybinds. If you turn settings like this and the reminders off, it'll clear up space on your screen, and it will also make you panic less, like in the example of the reload reminders. Because if I turn this on and then I start emptying my magazine here, you'll notice I'll get huge text on the screen that says reload that not only pushes you to want to reload, which in a lot of situations, especially with weapons with high magazine capacities, can get annoying, but it also just puts more stress on you because you start realizing that you have a lower magazine and it could end up causing you to play worse, which is why I've had this turned off for about a year now. Other important settings includes things like the health bar, which I know people like Spoit like to turn this off because it basically removes that from the bottom left of your screen. And since it causes a bright red flash in the bottom left of your screen, it can can cause a lot of people to get stressed out about their low HP, and it could cause them to end up making mistakes that they otherwise wouldn't have. So that's why players like Spoit and other popular content creators like to turn that off. But for me, I like to have it on numbers only, so that way I can still see what HP I'm at in the bottom left and then make decisions accordingly. A lot of the time, having that information about what HP you have can cause you to end up making better plays and positioning yourself more effectively, since you know that you're so low on HP. And right below the health settings, we have the status effects and the stance indicator setting. Basically what this will do is just remove any annoying timers and indicators off of your HUD that'll make it look more clean. Like the stance indicator just tells you whether you're crouched or standing or not, or prone, and it just shows up next to your HP in the bottom left corner. But I don't really need that, since obviously I know when I'm crouched and I obviously know when I'm prone. So there's no real point in having it on. And below all of this, towards the bottom of the HUD settings, we have another hugely important setting, which is the teammate outlines, teammate icons, and teammate username. These settings are what help you distinguish your teammates from enemy players. But I find myself liking the teammate icons on and everything else off, because the outlines have gotten me killed on multiple occasions because they end up lining up with an enemy that you're aiming at or something like that through walls, and it ends up causing you to second guess yourself and lose a gunfight. And also, in my opinion, it just takes up too much of your screen. Whereas having something just as simple as a operator icon on the top of a player can make it much easier for you to distinguish whether they're a teammate or not, and it also provides you with the information you need on what operator that is. You don't really need any other information outside of that. And below all of that, we have the match header, which I pretty much turn everything on in the match header because all of this information is important, with the exception of the versus update. This is a hugely important setting that a lot of players have on that, in my opinion, you should turn off. What versus update is it's basically the animation that plays anytime a player dies on your team or the enemy team that shows you how many people's alive on your team and how many people's alive on the enemy team. It'll flash up on your screen and say 4 versus 5, or it'll flash up on your screen and say 2 versus 3, for example. This setting is problematic because it affects your psychology and it causes you to end up playing worse in a lot of situations. Because if you see things like 2v5 on the top of your screen, you're going to start panicking and playing worse. And on the inverse, if you see that your team is significantly up in man count because of the versus update, then a lot of players will end up starting to play more aggressive and end up causing their team to lose the round because they think that they're at such a high man count that they can afford to just play aggressive and be stupid. Outside of those settings, the HUD is pretty much done and dusted. And for the audio tab, there are some pretty big settings in here that are worth noting. Firstly, your dynamic range. I've had night mode on my dynamic range for a very long time now, and trust me, it's a game changer. Night mode basically makes explosions and gunshots quieter in your audio, and it makes lower volume sounds like footsteps sound a lot louder. So if you're struggling with being able to hear footsteps over other things going on in the game, night mode is definitely going to help you out a lot, especially if you're someone who's playing on headphones. Now, if you're not playing Siege with headphones, then I recommend you get some, but if you don't have that as an option, then putting your audio on the other dynamic ranges could be an option. But for me personally, I find myself playing way better with night mode on because it makes it easier for me to hear footsteps. Now, under the dynamic range setting, there is a ton of volume sliders related to different in-game audio. None of these really matter. Most of these are personal preference, but the one thing I would recommend doing is turning off in-game music volume, because this will stop music from playing during the prep phase, the action phase, and after action. So it'll make it easier for you to hear footsteps. It'll make it easier for you to hear pretty much anything in game, and it'll also help you to play better because you won't have tense music playing in your ears 24/7. Outside of that, the only other important setting in here is the mono/stereo output, and you want this setting always turned on to stereo. That's because stereo allows your headphones to simulate audio coming from the left side and the right side, or behind you. But if you have it on mono, then it's going to make all of the audio sound like it's coming from the same spot, which is going to make it basically impossible for you to be able to hear where enemies are coming from and where the explosions and gunshots are coming from. Now, moving past the audio tab, we now have the display tab. And this is an area where a lot of newer players mess up. Firstly, you're going to want to have your refresh rate at the maximum possible refresh rate you can get on your monitor. And you're also going to want your display mode set to full screen, not windowed, and not borderless. Because if you have your display mode set to borderless or windowed, you're not going to be able to get the maximum refresh rate out of your monitor possible. And you want to have the maximum refresh rate on so that way you can visually see the maximum amount of frame rate. For example, if you leave your monitor on the default refresh rate that a lot of monitors ship with, which is 60 Hertz, then the only FPS you're actually seeing with your eyes is 60. Anything past that, you're not actually visually seeing on your screen, which is going to put you at a disadvantage compared to other players who have their refresh rate up higher. So whatever your monitor's maximum refresh rate is, make for sure you turn that on in this setting. And moving past that, we have aspect ratio, which this is a hugely controversial topic. Many players have different feelings and thoughts about different aspect ratios, and a lot of players play on vastly different aspect ratios. But for me personally, what I'm going to recommend to you if you're a newer player is to try 16:10, 16:9, 4:3, or 5:4. Now 16:10 and 16:9 are taller aspect ratios, meaning that your screen is being stretched more vertically than it is horizontally. So things are going to appear taller on your screen, and also things are going to appear to move slower across your screen since they're not being stretched horizontally. This gives you an advantage on high ping servers because enemies won't move past your screen as quickly as they would appear on other aspect ratios. However, if you turn your aspect ratio to something like 4:3 or the 5:4 that I mentioned earlier, then it's going to make your screen a lot wider, which is going to make things seem shorter, and it's going to stretch things out horizontally. But the reason why a lot of people like this, and some people consider it to be an advantage, is because enemies appear on your screen a lot bigger, because of the fact that they're going to be stretched horizontally across your screen like this. So it can make it easier for you to hit shots that you otherwise wouldn't be able to because enemies are going to appear bigger. But because they're bigger on your screen horizontally, they also move faster, which means that in theory, you're going to have a harder time hitting a sprinting enemy on 4:3 than you would on 16:10 or 16:9. All of these trade-offs are just something that you're going to have to experiment with yourself to discover what you prefer. I've always been someone who's really enjoyed the 16:10 aspect ratio because I'd rather be able to see my opponents for a longer period of time on my screen than for them to show up bigger. Now, right below the aspect ratio setting, we have the VSync setting. Now, if you're not a content creator, you're not someone who enjoys recording or has any purpose for recording, then you should turn off VSync 100% because it increases your input delay, which means that the time between your keyboard presses and your mouse presses to show up on your screen will take longer. Now, it's not a significant amount, but it is still a factor. And the reason why that is the case is because VSync basically syncs your frame rate with your monitor's refresh rate, which basically means that your PC will no longer be pushing out more frames than what your monitor can support. And it also try to get your PC to stay on that frame rate that your monitor supports. And the reason why I have this on as a content creator is because if you have VSync off, it'll cause your OBS and other applications that you have open on your PC to run significantly slower. So because I'm having to record on OBS a lot and also just record gameplay in general, having VSync on can fix a lot of issues with recording softwares, and so that's why I have it on. If I wasn't recording all of the time, then I'd have it off 100%. The last important setting on this screen is the field of view. I personally recommend just cranking this all the way up. It allows you to see way more area on your screen. For example, this is what a 60 FOV looks like. As you can tell, my visibility is significantly reduced, whereas if I go into the settings and turn back on my 90 FOV, I'll be able to see a lot more and the game just looks a lot better. Now, moving past the display tab, we have the graphics tab, which this is going to be way more subjective based on your machine requirements and what kind of specs you have on your computer. Now, for me, since I have a 4090 and a 13900K, I can easily run ultra settings on Rainbow Six Siege without it hurting my frame rate significantly. And I actually get better frame rate typically on ultra settings since I have a 4090 because my CPU ends up running behind my 4090. So if I turn up the graphics settings and put more reliance on my 4090, I actually get more frame rate typically. But if you're just the average person, what I used to run on my old PC that wasn't nearly as good is I used to set my settings to low. I used to turn on my texture quality to medium, so that way gun skins would still look somewhat decent. But the setting would also have a huge effect on my ability to run the game at a higher frame rate. And I turn up shadow quality to high. The reason why I recommend turning shadow quality to high is because it can cause you to win gunfights that you normally wouldn't be able to, because it'll allow you to see player shadows at a much higher quality and from a much farther distance. So shadows actually do aid you in winning more gunfights, and so you should have this setting to at least medium, if not high, so that way you can get that advantage of being able to see shadows from a greater distance. But realistically, you're just gonna have to tweak all of these settings until you find the setup that allows you to get the most FPS out of your system while still not sacrificing any sort of gameplay aspect. And moving past graphics, we now have control. Now, this is going to be something that's pretty subjective on a player-by-player basis, but I'll just give you the rundown of what my settings are, so that way you can get an idea of what I'm working with, and so you can take inspiration for your own setup if you'd like. Now, for mouse sensitivity, I have mine set to 5 horizontal and 5 vertical, and I have a DPI of 800, which basically means in my mouse software, I've set the sensitivity in my mouse software to 800 DPI. And if you want to see my mouse ADS sensitivity, this is what it looks like. Typically, I'd recommend if you're going to mess with the mouse advanced sensitivity settings here, you're going to want to have your 1.0 magnification be significantly lower than all of your other site magnifications, because your sensitivity is naturally lower on higher magnification sites. And so cranking up the sensitivity on these higher magnification sites will make it easier for you to flick with those scopes. I would just recommend going into the shooting range and messing around with this until you find something that feels to your liking. The same thing applies to the mouse sensitivity. I personally started out with a 7.7 sensitivity, I think because it was either Bolo or some other big content creator that I was watching at the time had that sensitivity, and so I just ripped it and then started adjusting it to my liking over time. And that's just what I'd recommend you doing. Either take my sensitivity or go find another really good player like Spoit or Bolo and take their sensitivity and then adjust it over time to your liking. Now below sensitivity, we have a bunch of other important options in the menu that is going to have a huge effect on your ability to win gunfights. Now the first of them is the mouse scroll option, which I personally set to disable because I don't like switching weapons with my scroll wheel. And also you can easily hit your scroll wheel on accident when you're in the middle of a gunfight or when you're running around the map. And so you can end up accidentally switching weapons, which can end up getting you killed. So most of the time I just recommend binding your weapon swap to some other key on your keyboard. Now for gadget deployment, this is pretty much entirely subjective. It won't really affect your ability to play the game much. For me, I like advanced, so that way when I pull out my gadget, I'm not immediately locked into an animation. I prefer having to actually click a button to start the animation of placing a gadget than just having to release the gadget button, because you can end up placing a gadget before you mean to on accident or throwing something before you mean to on accident. And so for me, advanced is much better. And for drone deployment, I 100% recommend advanced as well, because when you throw a drone, you don't want to immediately hop on the drone, because sometimes a defender could run out on you because they hear you throw the drone. And if you have your settings set to standard, then you're going to be on your tablet, not being able to react to the defender jumping out on you, which means that defenders can basically get a free kill on you whenever you throw a drone. So definitely turn this on to advanced, so that way you don't die while trying to use your drone. Now for aim, this is totally subjective. You can have this set to hold or you can have this set to toggle. For me, I find hold to be way more natural because I've used it in every other FPS game for my entire life, and so toggle just seems kind of weird to me. But if you like toggle, you can go with toggle. It's up to you. However, for pretty much every other control setting, I set it to toggle, because leaning, sprinting, crouching, and proning, I want to set to toggle so that way I can free up that finger that I would use to be holding down crouch or holding down sprint, and I can use it for another key on my keyboard. Because what you don't want to do is have multiple of your fingers stuck on keys. For example, if you were crouching and leaning, you'd have to have two keys held down at once if you had your settings set to hold, which would basically mean that two of your fingers were not able to be used for that entire duration. Now for me, since I'm a PC player, I'm going to be showing you my keybinds on PC, but if you're a console player and you want to skip past this, that's fine. There'll be a timestamp in the description if you'd like to move on to the next topic. Now for controls, this is basically entirely personal preference, but I'll just go ahead and scroll through so that way you can see all of my settings, and I'll talk about some of the more important ones and some of the more nuanced settings that I have on my keyboard. Most of them I've kept default, but there are some key differences. The first is push to talk, which I have set to Z, so that way I can hit it with my ring finger while I'm playing the game or with my pinky, because I just find that to be easier than binding it anywhere else. Then further down in my settings for my crouch, I have my crouch set to V. The reason why that is just because it's easier for me to hit it with my thumb, because my thumb just naturally rests on the V key most of the time. And so I prefer to have my crouch set to that instead of C, so that way I can just hit it more easily. But once again, this is entirely subjective, so it's kind of just how I feel. And then for prone, I have that set to control. And then for alt walking, I have that set to B, because once again, I just find my thumb more naturally resting on the B key, and it's just easier for me to alt walk with B than it would be for me to just leave it to the default alt button. And then going below, I have my interact set to C, because once again, it's another key that's easily accessible by the thumb, but it's a little less convenient and natural than something like the V key, which is why I have my crouch set to V and not C, because like I said, it's just a little more natural for me to rest my thumb on the V key. Then scrolling down a little bit further, my secondary gadget is set to my mouse button, because I just found that to be the most natural place to put my secondary gadget. And then for deploying drone, I had that also set to one of my mouse buttons, because I just find that to be the most convenient. And then scrolling farther down, I have my weapon swap bind set to N, because that's another key that my thumb can easily access. And so I set my weapon swap to that, so that way I don't have to switch weapons with my scroll wheel, and I can instead just use N. And then for dropping diffuser, I set it to M, because it's another key that can be easily accessible by the thumb. And that's pretty much it for controls, since the rest of the controls are just observation tools and spectator camera related settings, which don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And moving past the control tab, we have the final important tab of the settings menu, which is accessibility. Now, there are a few important options in here that are worth pointing out. Firstly, your optic color. I've covered this extensively in previous videos about how to get better aim and stuff, but I'll go ahead and rehash that here. Typically, you're going to want to have your optic color be something that stands out amongst objects around most maps. So you're going to want something like the default color, which is red and green. You're going to want green potentially, or you're going to want dark red. Pretty much all of these other colors you can find extensively in other maps, or they're just hard to see with. Now below that, we have the screen shake intensity. You're going to want to have this off all of the time. Screen shake basically just means that when an explosion goes off, your screen is going to shake back and forth, which is going to make it harder for you to see stuff that's going on. When, for example, you set off a cluster charge, you get nitrocelled, or a grenade goes off, or pretty much anything explosive goes off in your area. Have this off almost all of the time. And then the final important option that I think is worth noting is the team colors that you go with. Now, the reason why this setting is so important is because it changes the color of gadgets on your team. So if you have your team color set to red and the enemy team's color set to blue, it'll make the enemy team's gadgets stand out more. For example, if I was to put a claymore right here on the red staircase, you're going to see that the claymore blends in a lot more with the red carpet with this setting than if I was to change the color to blue, because the blue lines contrast heavily with the red carpet on red stairs here. This same philosophy applies to many other gadgets in the game, but for Claymore specifically, it's just the most dramatic example, which is why I'm showing it here. But having the enemy team's colors set to blue and having your team set to red will make a lot of other gadgets in the game stand out. Anyways, that about wraps up today's video. Let me know if you found this video useful and if you have any other setting suggestions. Please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's video, I make Siege content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss the next upload. If you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.